So every year, around about the month of June, the organization that we know as Vinnie's runs a fundraising event called the CEO Sleep Out. You may have heard of it, you may have even participated in it. The idea behind the event is that they gather a bunch of CEOs and others from the C-suite of some of the biggest organizations and corporations around the nation, and they spend a night out on the streets to raise money for the organization and, of course, to raise awareness for the issue of homelessness. It's a wonderful initiative. Every year they raise an enormous amount of money. In fact, this year I think they raised $8.5 million, which is a wonderful result. And, of course, it does throw the spotlight on the very important issue of homelessness. Now, as wonderful as the event is, I think you will agree that spending a single night out on the street in your $300 sleeping bag and your $500 polar fleece jacket from Kathmandu, with your beanies and your gloves and your smoldering hot cup of sponsored coffee, is hardly an incarnation of the reality of homelessness as it is experienced by the people for whom homelessness is a reality every day of their lives. Not that it's meant to be, but I think you will agree that it's not really a true experience or reflection of the experience that homeless people endure every day of their lives. Now, that becomes particularly apparent when you compare the experience of the CEO Sleep Out with the life of a man by the name of Joseph de Worcester. Now, Joseph de Worcester was a Catholic priest who took on the name Father Damien when he moved to a small, rather remote village called Kalawao on the island of Molokai in Hawaii. And this particular little village had been set apart, it had been kind of quarantined and isolated from the rest of the island to function as a leper colony. And anyone who contracted that dreaded disease in that part of the world was sent to that village to die. And when Father Damien heard about this little leper colony, he was so moved with compassion for them that he decided to sell up all his possessions, take whatever he could carry, and move to the island and to that village to serve the people there, and that he did. And so he spent his days building them homes and building a school. He built a church and began to run services like we're enjoying today. He taught them music and they formed a band. He taught them how to sing and they formed a choir. In fact, he even built 2,000 coffins, wooden coffins by hand, so that when people did die, they could be buried with some degree of dignity. And so gradually, over a period of time, Father Damien transformed life inside Kalawao to be the kind of place where people could actually live, rather than a place where people just simply went to die. And at no point at all did he attempt to separate himself from the people that he was loving and serving. So there was no PPE, there was no social distancing, they didn't wear masks, he didn't have gloves, there was no hand sanitizer. He would just live amongst them and work amongst them. He would sleep alongside them at night. He would cook with them in the kitchen. He would sit down at the same dinner table to eat with them. He would put his hand in the same bowl that they were eating from. There was no attempt at all to separate himself from the people he was loving. And one Sunday morning, he stood up in church in front of the congregation, and as he began his sermon, he said these words. He said, "We lepers need God." And as you can imagine, the lepers were somewhat taken aback by what he said and were a little confused about what was going on. But evidently what had happened was the night before, Father Damien had spilled some boiling water onto his hand and didn't feel any pain. And it occurred to him that he had now contracted the disease as well. And so not only was he living amongst them, but he had now literally become one of them. He was now not only living in their village, but he was now living in their skin. And he had come there to live amongst them, but now he would die amongst them. And die he did, after spending a significant amount of his adult life loving them and serving them and caring for them. And that, friends, is incarnation. That is love in action. And here we are right in the middle of the Advent season. We are literally 2 weeks away from celebrating one of the most important truths in the Christian faith, and that is the truth of the coming of the Son of God. The truth that God's light broke into our darkness, and God himself wrapped himself in human flesh, and he came not only to us, but he became like us, and lived amongst us and loved us and served us and ultimately gave his life for us so that we can know what it is to be loved by God and so that we can have the opportunity to be restored to relationship with God. That wonderful truth that God traveled to our little island in the sky and rolled up his sleeves and climbed down into the trenches of our human experience and walked with us and talked with us and loved us and lived with us and then ultimately died for us. And today, as we reflect on the magnitude of that truth, the truth of the incarnation, I want to share some implications of that truth with you today that come to us from one of my favorite books in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews. And today I want to just follow the advice and the counsel of the writer to the Hebrews, who exhorts us with these words in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those called to heaven, think carefully about this Jesus. Consider this Jesus. Meditate on Jesus. Contemplate Jesus, whom we declare to be God's messenger and our high priest." And friends, that is exactly what we're going to do this morning. And that is what we're going to do over the course of the next 2 weeks, which of course is going to culminate on December 25th, when we celebrate that momentous moment in human history when God broke into the human experience in the form of Jesus. And notice that the writer to the Hebrews says here that Jesus came to earth for 2 reasons. Number 1, to be God's messenger, and number 2, to be our high priest. So Jesus came to earth first and foremost to be God's messenger. And in coming to earth as God's messenger, Jesus came not only to bring the message, but to be the message, to personify and exemplify through his life and example exactly what it is that God has been trying to communicate to all of humanity. Jesus, through his life and his word and his witness, through the miracles he performed, through the things he did, demonstrated to us what it is that God wanted us to know. And so consequently, Jesus became to us the clearest, fullest, like most compelling revelation of God that the world has ever seen. That means if you want to know and understand God, you only need to look at Jesus. If you want to know what God values, look at Jesus. If you want to know what God thinks, look at Jesus. If you want to know what God prioritizes, look at Jesus. Jesus came to be the clarifying revelation of what God is really like. And any concept that you have concerning God that does not align with the person of Jesus needs to be recalibrated and needs to be corrected. We do not start with a perception of God and then conclude, oh, well, that's what Jesus must be like. We begin with the revelation of Jesus, the visible image of the invisible God. And on the basis of the revelation of who Jesus is, we come to understand who God truly is. And so as the clearest, most compelling revelation of God the world has ever seen, Jesus challenged some of the assumptions that people were making about God. So people who were assuming that God was an impersonal cosmological force kind of hovering about in the ether, holding things together, some kind of impersonal power, discovered in Jesus that God is a person. God is a being. God is relatable, and God is knowable, and God is emotional, and God can be heard, and God can be spoken to. Those who assumed that God was angry and vengeful and hateful and judgmental discovered in Jesus that God is loving, and God is merciful, and God is kind, and he's friendly, and he's patient. Those who had assumed that God was indifferent, that he was like far off somewhere watching us from a distance, discovered in Jesus that God is immanent. God is with us. God is amongst us. God is as close to us as the breath we breathe. God is Emmanuel. God, in fact, is so concerned about us that he's willing to come and immerse himself in the reality of our experience so that we can identify with him and he can identify with us. And so Jesus comes to us as this profound revelation of the person of God to challenge our assumptions about who God is, but to give us a clarifying self-disclosure of God so that we might know God more accurately and more truly. So he comes to us as God's messenger, not only to bring the message, but to be the message. And thank God for Jesus, God's messenger. But notice that the writer to the Hebrews goes on to say that Jesus not only came to be God's messenger, he also came to be our high priest. Now, I know for many of you sitting here today, the concept of the high priest is kind of well known to you. You would know what the role was and what it refers to, but not everybody would be familiar. So let me take a moment just to explain. Back in the Old Testament, in the context of Jewish religious life, there was an office, the highest office of the priesthood, known as the high priest. And this particular individual was given the privilege and the opportunity and the responsibility of once a year, on a particular day called the Day of Atonement, going into the very presence of God in the Holy of Holies. That's like the most sacred part of the temple anyone could access. And he would go there to offer a sacrifice on behalf of the entire nation to atone for their sins. And he was the only individual who got to go there, and the only person who experienced the presence of God like in a personal, first-hand experiential kind of way. Now, the writer to the Hebrews goes to great lengths to explain to us that through his death, burial, and resurrection, Jesus became our ultimate high priest. He entered the ultimate Holy of Holies, the ultimate sanctuary, the temple of heaven, and he presented himself as the sacrifice once and for all people, and then took up his position as our advocate, our representative, our ultimate high priest. Now, the writer to the Hebrews explains this in great detail over the course of 9 chapters, from Hebrews chapter 2 to Hebrews chapter 10. We're, of course, not going to deep dive into all of that today, but it's a fascinating study. So if you're keen to know more about Jesus as our high priest, that's where you want to go. Hebrews chapter 2 through to Hebrews chapter 9. But what the writer to the Hebrews does want us to know, and what we do need to know for our conversation today, is that it was precisely because Jesus was incarnated that he is uniquely positioned to function as our high priest. It is because Jesus came to us and became like us that he is uniquely qualified to serve as our high priest. And so the writer to the Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17 to 18, he says, therefore it was necessary for Jesus to be like us, his brothers and sisters, so that he could be our merciful and faithful high priest before God. A priest who would be both merciful to us and faithful to God in dealing with the sins of the people. For since he himself has now been through suffering and temptation, he knows what it's like when we suffer and are tempted, and he is wonderfully able to help us. So here the writer to the Hebrews is saying, because Jesus was incarnated, because God came in human flesh and lived amongst us, he's able to identify with us. He can empathize with us. He can sympathize with us because he knows what we go through. He goes through the reality of our human experience in every way. So Jesus knows what it feels like to be tired. And he knows what it feels like to be disappointed. And he knows what it feels like to be lied to. Anyone ever been betrayed by a friend? Jesus knows what that feels like. Anyone ever been hurt, offended, or disappointed? Oh, Jesus knows what that feels like. Ever been frustrated or anxious? Jesus knows what that feels like. Jesus knows what it feels like to be human. Of course, on the upside, he knows what it feels like to experience joy and delight and contentment and gladness and satisfaction. But he knows what it feels like to experience the agony and the reality of human experience. And at the extreme end of human experience, Jesus knows what it feels like to be persecuted. He knows what it feels like to be literally beaten. He knows what it feels like to suffer an injustice. He even knows what it feels like to die. In other words, Jesus can fully relate and he can fully understand. Whatever it is you're going through, he knows what that feels like. And so because of it, he is able to identify, he's able to relate, and he's able to represent. And so the writer to the Hebrews says this has 2 very profound implications for us today. Number 1, the first is this: with Jesus as our high priest, we have help for today. By that I mean we have an ever-present, like perpetually reliable, always accessible source of grace and strength and wisdom and power and inspiration and encouragement and provision for whatever it is we are going through in life. With Jesus as our high priest, we have help for today, which is why the writer to the Hebrews says in Hebrews 4, verse 14 to 16, he says, so then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same temptations we do, yet he did not sin. So, let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. Right? Because we have a high priest who understands us and cares about us and feels compassion for us and can relate to us, there is help for you in your time of need. Now, one of the most unfortunate lessons in life that you are going to learn, and you've probably learned it already, is that not everyone you reach out to for help is going to be able to help you. Right? Like if you came to me today and you said, Tim, after the gathering, my car's parked out in the parking lot, it won't start, I can't get it going, can you help me? The answer is no, I can't help you. Sorry. It's not that I'm not willing, it's just that I'm not able, because I know nothing about cars. I couldn't tell a carburetor from a radiator, a piston from a spark plug. I got no idea. And I could not possibly express in words how much I don't care about cars. I'm sorry, my apologies to all you rev heads, because I know there's a few rev heads here and you love your cars. I love you, but I don't understand you. I don't get why you love cars so much, right? So I can call RAC for you. I can get you a tow truck. I can buy you a coffee. I'll stand and have a conversation until somebody comes who can help you, but I can't help you, right? Now, if you said to me, Tim, Friday night I've been invited to a poker game and I've never played the game before and I don't know how to play, can you help me learn the game? Can you teach me how to play the game? Can you help me win? I'm like, yeah, I can help you. You've come to the right place, because I love that game and I play it so well. You'll be walking out there number one, I guarantee it, right? I can help you with that, right? So not everyone you reach out to for help will be able to help. That's life, right? In fact, I read a story not too long ago, a true story about a man in the U.S., I think it was from Missouri or Mississippi, by the name of George Phillips, who was locking up his house one night, and he was, locking the doors and turning off the lights, and he was in the kitchen, and he noticed at the back end of the garden in the shed there was a light on. And there were shadows moving around in the shed, and he figured somebody's broken into my shed, they're going to steal my stuff. So he calls 911, and he speaks to the operator. The operator says, what's your emergency? He says, well, there's somebody, in my shed at the far end of the garden, and I think they're stealing my stuff. And so the operator says, so are you in danger? Are they armed? He says, I don't know, I can't see. She says, are you sure they're kind of not in the house? He said, they're not in the house, they're in the shed. She said, all right, well, just lock the doors, stay inside. Right now, we don't have any patrol cars available because they're all busy, but we will send someone as soon as somebody is available. Well, needless to say, George was not particularly happy with that response, so he hangs up. He waits a couple of minutes, he phones back. He says, hi, this is George Phillips. I spoke to you a few minutes ago concerning the guards breaking into my shed. He said, don't worry about sending anyone. I went and got my gun, and I shot them all myself. And he hung up, right? Well, in about 3 minutes, there were like 2 police cars, an armed response unit, and an ambulance. They all pull up to George's house, and they catch the guys red-handed in his shed. So the officer says to him, I thought you shot them dead. He says, well, I thought you said no one was available, right? So the point is, the help you need is not always forthcoming, and the people you reach out to are not always able to help you. But here's the good news. Jesus is always able to help. And not only is he able, but he is willing. And when you find yourself at the end of your rope, when you get to the end of your tether and you are out of ideas and you don't know what to do, when you fall to your knees, literally or metaphorically, before the throne of God's grace and you cry out to Jesus for help, he will help. And friends, I cannot tell you how often I've been in that position where I have come to the end of myself and I can do nothing but call out to the throne of God and say, God, help. And the help is always forthcoming. Now, it doesn't always come in the way that I think it should come. It doesn't always come via the people I think it should come through. Sometimes it's surprising, sometimes it's unexpected, but Jesus has never failed to help in my time of need because we have a high priest who loves us, cares about us, understands us, has been through what we're going through, and is more than able to help in our time of need. So with Jesus as our high priest, you have help for today. An ever-present, always available, always reliable source of wisdom and courage and perspective and providence and protection and guidance and instruction. It's all there and it's available to you. But notice that the writer to the Hebrews goes on to say that with Jesus as our high priest, not only do we have help for today, but we have hope for tomorrow. We have hope for tomorrow. And by that, I don't just mean a kind of a vague general optimism about your future. I mean a very concrete, very specific, very particular hope that not only involves the rest of your life here on earth, but actually translates into your life beyond life here on earth in the kingdom to come, in the age after this. And so the writer to the Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18 to 20, he says, therefore, we who have fled to God for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest. What a beautiful image this is. The writer to the Hebrews says, because we have Jesus as a high priest, we have hope that anchors our souls. Right? What does an anchor do? An anchor stabilizes and steadies a ship. That's what it does in the midst of a storm. And that's what your hope does. Your hope functions as an anchor for your soul. It gives you stability and steadfastness and certainty and security in the midst of all of life's adversity. But you know that an anchor is only as steadfast as that to which it is attached. So you've got to ask yourself the question, to what have you attached the anchor of your hope? Because if you have attached the anchor of your hope to economic recovery or to decreasing inflation or to your investment portfolio or to a political outcome or to an individual or to a relationship or to any other human being, you have attached the anchor of your hope to something movable and shakeable. Something uncertain and unstable and unpredictable. You have got to fasten the anchor of your hope to the immovable, unshakable rock of ages who is Jesus himself. That is the only foundation that's never going to move. So where is your hope? Is it in him or is it in somebody else? The only way you're going to experience a steadfastness in your soul and peace for your mind is when your hope is anchored to him. Because he is the immovable rock of ages. And as I said, this is not a kind of vague, general kind of optimism for the future. This is a very particular, very concrete, very specific kind of hope. And I'm going to rely on the Apostle Paul here to elaborate on what this hope is. Because he talks about it in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. And this is the articulation that Paul offers of the dimensions of this particular hope that we have. So listen to what he says in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. He says, and now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope. So he's saying, hey, we're going to die, but when we do, it's important that we die with a particular perspective in mind. Sure, we're going to experience grief and sorrow. And if you've ever lost anyone you love, you know what that grief and that sorrow feels like. But Paul says we hold that grief and that sorrow in tension with this very real hope, right? And here's the hope. He goes on to elaborate on it. Number one, the first is the hope of Jesus' return. In other words, there's a day coming when Christ will come back, literally, physically, to usher in his kingdom and to set the world right. Now, I don't know about you, but that's good news, right? And we're supposed to live in anticipation of that day like a 4-year-old on Christmas Eve. You're supposed to be expectant. Part of my concern for the church in the 21st century is that it seems we've lost some of our sense of anticipation for the parousia. Like we do not think about the second coming of Jesus, and we do not live like it could be imminent. But it could be any moment. So Paul says the first dimension of our hope is the hope of his return. Listen to what he says in verse 15. He says, we tell you this directly from the Lord. We who are still living when the Lord returns will not meet him ahead of those who have died. There is a day coming when Jesus will return. What a glorious day that will be. And it's a day that you and I should look forward to. But Paul goes on to say, the second dimension of our hope is the hope of our resurrection. This is the hope of eternal life. The hope of life beyond the grave. The hope of life in the new creation, in the kingdom of God. When God wraps up human history as we know it and ushers in the full reign of God on the earth, we will know resurrection life. And so Paul says in verse 16, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of an archangel and with the trumpet call of God. And first, the Christians who have died will rise from their graves. This, friends, is resurrection life. And this is part of our hope. I don't know about you, but I find that fascinating. That on the other side of this life, there is a physical, material, corporeal reality awaiting us in the new heavens and the new earth. I know you might think of your eternal destiny as being some kind of disembodied spiritual existence in a place called heaven, but that's not the biblical vision. It's not the biblical hope. The hope is for a new heaven and a new earth, a new creation. And with that, new bodies conformed to the body of the resurrected Jesus, free from sin, free from sickness, free from pain. And you can read all that about that body in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul talks about it there. The hope of our resurrection. But that's not all. He goes on to say the third aspect of our hope is the hope of a reuniting. A reuniting with those in the faith who have gone before us. Those who have died before we have. In verse 17 of 1 Thessalonians 4, he says, then together with them, we who are still alive and remain on the earth will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. In other words, there's going to come a day when we will not only see Jesus face to face, but we will be reunited with those in the faith who have died before us. Now, again, I don't know about you, but I find that to be good news because I've had people in my life who I love who have gone on to be with the Lord. In fact, just 3 years ago, my dad passed away after a very brief but brutal battle with cancer. He was diagnosed the day after he retired. And 5 months later, he was gone. That was right in the height of the COVID pandemic. So we were stuck here in Perth. Couldn't travel. Couldn't be at his funeral. I had to say goodbye to my dad on WhatsApp. It was hard. And we feel the grief. And we feel the sorrow. But man, there's a hope in my heart. Because he loved Jesus. And there's a day coming where we will be reunited in the new creation. That's an anchor for my soul. But that's not all. There's more. I feel like an infomercial salesman this morning. Last but not least, the hope of our reward. The hope of our reward. Paul says in verse 17, then we will be with the Lord forever. Somebody once asked the question, what do I get for following Jesus? The answer is you get Jesus. He is our reward. He is our treasure and our exceedingly great reward.